Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor and the Robert E. Howard Show. It's the Robert E. Howard Show once again. I like to try at least once a week to talk about my favorite writer of all time, Robert E. Howard. And today we're taking a break from Conan. We're in the midst of Conan's adventures here on the Robert E. Howard Show. Last week we talked about the Tower of the Elephant. Next week it's going to be the Scarlet Citadel. But this week I wanted just to have a quick little video to talk about something I frequently call Robert E. Howard the greatest pulp writer who ever lived. That's because he was. He was the greatest pulp writer who ever lived. And I thought, well, maybe I should explain that. I have gotten a couple questions. Well, what about this person? And, well, what about that person? There were other great writers who wrote in the pulps, that is for sure. So let's talk a little bit about what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Robert E. Howard being the greatest pulp writer. What were the pulps for the first thing? If you are unfamiliar, the pulp magazines were magazines that published shorter fiction, and sometimes they would serialize longer fiction in magazine form. And the pulp magazines were popular from the 20s all the way up through until the early 1950s. And then some of them transformed into these little digest magazines, but most of them died out right around that time, to be replaced by other media, paperback books, other things. And to write for a pulp magazine, you had to do certain things well. So there were several different types of pulp magazines. There were pulp magazines on all kinds of different subjects. There were detective pulp magazines. There were Western pulp magazines. There were romance pulp magazines. There were pulp magazines about pilots. So there were air pulp magazines. There were baseball pulp magazines, boxing pulp magazines. There used to actually be a market for stories about baseball and boxing. Historical fiction pulp magazines, you name it, there probably was a pulp magazine about it, including weirder fiction and fantasy fiction. There were few of those, but they existed. The most popular being Weird Tales, which was Robert E. Howard's chief market. That's where Robert E. Howard published most of his major stories, along with the other giants of Weird Tales, which would be Clark Ashton Smith, a great writer who I probably have not talked enough about on my channel because he's great, and of course, H.P. Lovecraft. Weird Tales published most of H.P. Lovecraft's stories. So you had all these different pulp magazines. Now, to be a successful pulp writer, there were certain things you had to do well. For the pulps, since a lot of the fiction was short, they were very plot-driven. They tended to be very plot-driven genre stories for the most part. A lot of action. They had to move fast for the most part, depending on the type of story it was. But usually, to be a pulp story, a lot of action, had to move fast, didn't have a ton of time to get your story told, and usually you wanted a good pace. You know, you're getting right into this story. You're moving it right along. And the greatest pulp writers were able to do that. And because a lot of the pulps were printed during the Depression, you wanted to write as much as you could if you were a pulp writer, and that's what you did. You wanted to get as much fiction out there and sell to as many markets probably as you could, so you can get a decent income and, you know, not starve like people were during the Depression. Also, sometimes you might have deadlines. So you had a lot of things going on if you were a pulp writer. You didn't have a lot of space for nuance, you know. Uh, and so Robert E. Howard, he was great at all that. And he was able to go beyond it while still being what a pulp writer should be. Now, he wasn't the greatest writer who wrote in the pulps. That is true. But a lot of the other writers who went on to become great writers, or very well-known writers, they all had something else going on, I think, with their fiction and with their intentions for their fiction. Robert E. Howard was a pulp writer through and through. That's what he liked. That's what he was interested in. That's the kind of story he enjoyed. So he really was perfect for it. He was a natural storyteller, I believe. And these were the kinds of stories he was a natural at, and the kind of stories that he enjoyed. He didn't have any literary pretensions. He wasn't a big fan of literary fiction. Now, there were other writers, like I said, who were great writers. You have Raymond Chandler, who wrote in the pulps. He wrote in Black Mask magazine. So did Dashiell Hammett. Two writers who have gone on to be considered really great writers. They are in the Library of America. They are considered literature. And I think they both had literary pretensions. They had something that they wanted to say in their fiction that was beyond just pulp type of fiction. They had other things they wanted to work out and say. And I think they did. They were successful. So they weren't purely, in my opinion, pulp writers. They were something else. The same thing, I think, can be said for H.P. Lovecraft in a different way. H.P. Lovecraft was a great writer, really. I mean, people will challenge that. But he was. And again, another writer who managed to make it into the Library of America and Penguin Classics, and he is considered now a classic writer, one of the most influential horror writers of the 20th century. Probably is the most influential horror writer of the 20th century. And again, with Lovecraft, he wrote in the pulps because nobody else would publish what he had to write. He was only interested in writing weird stuff. He was only interested in writing horror and early science fiction and that kind of thing. He wanted to write that. He was driven to write that. And he considered himself an artist. And he didn't like revising his work. He wanted to just, he hated that whole process. He thought, I'm just going to write it once. And if it's not good enough, tough. He did not like revising things, which is something as a pulp writer, if you're a working pulp writer, you do. And Robert E. Howard did. If something was rejected and there were notes to the rejection, well, I'd publish it if you did this, he would do that. He was a working writer. And his best stuff was published in Weird Tales, his fantasy, adventure, and horror stuff. And I think that's the stuff he liked to write the most. He also liked to write historical fiction, and he liked to do that a lot, but there were not a lot of markets for that. But he had a pretty steady market in Weird Tales, and he really loved to write that kind of story. And I think it shows. But he was also really good at other things. He wrote a lot of boxing stories. And he had a steady market for his boxing stories. He also wrote humorous, tall tale type of Western stories. He had a market for that, and those were successful. He was really good at what he did. He was the best. And the reason why, I think, isn't just that he liked writing that type of thing, and this is where his focus would have been anyway, is this type of story, is that he was able to put himself so fully into his stories. I've read a bit of this before, but for the purposes of this video, I will read it again. This is from H.P. Lovecraft. After Robert E. Howard died, after he took his own life at the young age of 30, H.P. Lovecraft was shocked and deeply saddened because they wrote a lot of letters to each other, and they had become close correspondents. They were friends from a distance. And Lovecraft was a big fan of Robert E. Howard's work. They were big fans of each other. But this is what Lovecraft wrote about Robert E. Howard after Robert E. Howard passed away. It is hard to describe precisely what made Mr. Howard's stories stand out so sharply, but the real secret is that he himself was in every one of them, whether they were ostensibly commercial or not. He was greater than any profit-making policy he could adopt, for even when he outwardly made concessions to mammon-guided editors and commercial critics, he had an internal force and sincerity which broke through the surface and put the imprint of his personality on everything he wrote. Seldom, if ever, did he set down a lifeless stock character or situation and leave it as such. Before he concluded with it, it always took on some tinge of vitality and reality in spite of popular editorial policy. Always drew something from his own experience and knowledge of life, instead of from the sterile herbarium of desiccated, pulpish standbys. And that's true. Robert E. Howard put himself completely in what he wrote. Probably not everything. Some of his spicy adventure stories were pretty bad. But for the most part, almost always, when he was writing a story, he was in that story. He was focused. He would shout out the lines of his story as he was typing them. He was deeply involved in what he wrote, and he took what he wrote very seriously. He took his work very seriously. And I think it shows, man. He had such a natural ability. Let me just read you one little other thing, just from the beginning of The Shadow Kingdom, just to give you just a sense of his natural style. This is the first paragraph of The Shadow Kingdom. It's short. The blare of trumpets grew louder, like a deep golden tide surge, like the soft booming of the evening tides against the silver beaches of Volusia. The throng shouted. Women flung roses from the roofs as the rhythmic chiming of silver hoofs came clearer, and the first of the mighty array swung into view in the broad white street that curved around the golden-spired tower of splendor. So that's just like a short opening paragraph to his story, and you're there. You know, you are there in this other world, in the pre-cataclysmic age. He was able to draw you in and tell a story in a short amount of space and give you real characters. Now, a lot of times in pulp fiction, they were moving so quickly that a lot of the characters tended to be cardboard cutouts. Not always, but a lot of characters kind of were in the pulps. Robert E. Howard didn't do that. He tended to populate his stories with real people, and he was able to make his characters real in a very short amount of space. He didn't have a lot of room to world build or develop characters, yet he managed to do both of those things and tell a really good story. Sometimes he would tell stories in 60 pages that were as good as any novel you could read and as involving. That takes talent. And he was the best at it, at doing that in a purely pulp story, because he was a purely pulp writer, which is that's not saying anything against him. That's a good thing. It's a good thing to be the best at what you do, and he was. And that's all I have to say about Robert E. Howard this week, but catch me next week when we talk about the Scarlet Citadel.